If you say, I'm going to begin my consideration of the spiritual life with original sin, I would say, no, we're off to a bad start. You don't begin with original sin. Begin, rather, with this marvelous original permission.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. Did you know that Eden was on a mountain? Or how should we understand the creation of Adam and Eve? And what actually happened at the fall? Well, those are the questions we're going to discuss here in this episode, continuing our series on understanding Genesis. And we're going to be discussing them with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon, how you doing? I want to hear more about that cow you mentioned a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
You got a cow now on your
We do.
On your territory.
We've got a Holstein cow on our little homestead here. She's only 9 months. We can't breed her and milk her until she's a couple years old. But those who know cows, she's a Holstein breed, which is apparently the biggest milk producer. And the person who sold it to us said, look, you got to be ready because she's going to be producing 12 to 17 gallons of milk a day when she's milking. So our kids are going to be gorging on milk, I'm sure.
Well, and I suggested you should make cheese, and then they send that out across the country.
There we go. Cheese, butter.
Sure.
Okay, well, let's transition to your life. You recently got back from New Orleans. You were there attending and celebrating the Red Mass. Tell us what that was about.
Yeah, it was fun. That's the second Red Mass I preached at. Red Mass, was a special Mass, usually in October, for the legal community, so for lawyers and judges and politicians. I did one a few years ago in Honolulu, which was a delight, and this year in the wonderful city of New Orleans. And I was in the cathedral there, the first time I'd visited the cathedral, beautiful place. And the governor of Louisiana was there, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I think most of the justices of the Supreme Court of Louisiana were there, all sorts of federal and local judges and lawyers and law students, etc. So we had a mass to ask God's intercession over their, or God's protection over their work. But then I gave a somewhat substantive homily, more like a little lecture on church, state, politics, religion, that sort of thing. And I invoked everybody from the author of the letter to Diognetus from the 2nd century, from the same time as Irenaeus, by the way. That letter goes back to the time of Marcus Aurelius. I invoked Aquinas on law, and I invoked the great Alexis de Tocqueville as he reflected on democracy in America. So this did a somewhat higher level presentation on those issues.
There were a lot of articles covering your celebration of Mass there, and my favorite was at the end of one of those articles. At the end, it said the governor of Louisiana was in attendance there, and it said the governor asked Bishop Barron for a copy of his homily. Is that true?
Yeah, he sure did. His name is John Bell Edwards, and he's a Democrat, but he's pro-life Democrat, strongly pro-life. So I thanked him for that commitment, and then he said to me, well, I'm for the full range of life issues of capital punishment and euthanasia. And I said, yep, that's the right attitude, And then he asked me for a copy of the. So I just gave him the physical copy that I had in the pulpit.
Pretty cool. All right. Well, again, today we're continuing our series titled Understanding Genesis. We did an episode a few weeks back on the creation story. Today we're going to move through the Adam, Eve, and fall portions of Genesis, and then in future episodes we'll keep powering through the book. So I want to start with Eden itself. You've noted before that there's an interesting feature in the description of the Garden of Eden, which I don't think most people have reflected on, namely that there's a river that flows out of Eden and then divides into 4 branches, including the Tigris and the Euphrates River. But when you think about it, topographically, this must mean that Eden was a bit of an elevated place if you have these 4 rivers flowing out of it, presumably down from it. So it's a kind of mountain. What's the significance of this geographic fact that Eden was an elevated place or a mountain?
Yeah, it's a great symbol, isn't it, throughout the Bible. So the mountain, the elevated place, where the creation, as it were, goes up and where God comes down and where the two of them meet. So it's always a privileged place of encounter, which is why Mount Sinai is where the law is given. It's why Mount Zion is where the temple is built. It's why Jesus gives the law on a mountain. It's why the transfiguration took place on a mountain height. It's why Calvary, even though it's a little tiny hill, is something like a mountain. The idea is it's the place of connection and encounter. That's why, Brandon, in the Bible, as I've suggested, the place of the law, the place of the temple, the place of sacrifice, the place of right preaching, those are all mountain places. It's where we encounter the Lord. So coming down from the mountain, coming down to the plain, would represent a sort of declension from this heightened spiritual experience. So I would read it that way poetically, as Eden being on a mountain, or Eden being a kind of mountain. It means it's a primal temple. It's a place of right praise. And we mentioned, I think, last time, is the whole purpose of humanity is to lead creation in a chorus of right praise. So think of the garden in its beauty and its fecundity as evocative of the temple, the place where humanity is doing what it's supposed to do. And from that rightly ordered humanity comes a rightly ordered world. I think all of that is contained in that beautifully suggested symbol, because it doesn't say, by the way, on the mountain of Eden, but the very fact, as you say, that the rivers flow from it means it's a heightened place. And again, the rivers too, life comes from the right praise of God, which is why now go to the prophet Ezekiel. When he envisions the restored temple, what's coming forth from its side but a great river, which then brings life and healing to the world. Same idea, isn't it? What flows forth from the side of Christ on the mountain of Calvary, but blood and water from his side? Same thing. From Eden and the rivers to the temple and the water coming forth to the side of Christ. It's the same image. And what does Jesus say in regard to the temple in Jerusalem? I'm going to tear down that place and in 3 days rebuild it, referring to the temple of his body, right? Carried all the way forward. What happens at every Mass? But life comes forth from this place for the renewal of the world. So that's why that little subtle hint of what Eden is like is filled with enormous symbolic import.
We read in the second chapter of Genesis how after God creates the heavens and the earth and the plants and the animals, then we get this evocative description of God creating the first man. And I want to read this line and then get your take on what's going on here, what the author is trying to convey. So Genesis says, God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. What are we to make of this line?
Brandon, was it 2 weeks ago we talked about St. Irenaeus and his battle against the Gnostics? And I suggested there that the hybrid quality of the human being is key to a lot of our poetry and a lot of our drama and a lot of the tension and beauty of being human, that we're both physical and spiritual. We're like animals and we're like angels. The medievals saw the human being as a microcosm for that reason, beautifully, I think, that we're very much of the earth, right? And we're like other animals. We can see it. Go to the zoo and you'll see how much like other animals we look and are. With our evolutionary perspective, that our bodies indeed emerged out of a much older biological history and so on. Well, that's now coming from the dust of the earth, as Genesis puts it, in not scientific language but poetic language, but making much the same point. That we're of the earth, good, and we should never forget that. That was the trouble with the Gnostikoi, whom Irenaeus was fighting. That's the trouble with all forms of Gnosticism, is it forgets that we come from the earth, that we are embodied, we're animals, Good, we should celebrate that. But at the same time, we're more than animals. Think of our friend G.K. Chesterton here, that's still, marvelous, everlasting man. It's not as though, our distant ancestors were classicists, and then a little further they were romantics, and then they were impressionists, and now we're post-impressionists. No, says Chesterton, between the animal world and our world, there's a big black line. There's a quantum leap. There's a qualitative difference between even the highest of the animals, who are simply of the earth, and us, who are of the earth. But we also have, and here's that lovely idea, the Ruach Adonai, the breath of the Lord. Remember that hovered over the surface of the waters, over the tohu vabohu? There's the Ruach Adonai, is the breath of God. Well, here, breathing into us what? What makes us distinctively human? This is our mind and our wills and our freedom, our properly spiritual capacity, which is qualitatively different than anything that exists in the animal kingdom. And I'm with Chesterton. Anyone that really knows animals knows this more clearly. They see it more clearly, right? There's a biblical anthropology that's really beautiful in its balance. The two ways that I mentioned a couple weeks ago, the two ways to solve it, I'm all spirit, I'm all matter, and both are deeply problematic. No, I come from the dust of the earth, but I've got the Ruach Adonai in me. I've got the spiritual power. Michelangelo, of course, expresses this in that, epically gorgeous image of the hand of God. Here's this body of Adam, which has come from the earth, but in that sort of electric charge that passes from the finger of God to the finger of Adam, that's the communication of the spiritual dimension, right? That's freedom, and that's will, and that's intellect. So Genesis says it here in poetic language of God breathing into us, and then we earthly animal things become a living being.
From there, we read how Adam surveys all of the animal kingdom and, as you just described, looks at all of it and realizes there's a difference there. I'm the only one who's like me. John Paul II in Theology of the Body describes it as the original solitude. He was just alone in his humanity. But then God causes a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. I'm going to read a couple lines about what happens next. God takes one of Adam's ribs and closes up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God takes from the man, he makes into a woman and brings her to the man. Then the man says, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman with a capital W, for out of man with a capital M, this one was taken." This is such a profound description. Help us unpack this.
Well, it's simply that you're right. Adam's found a proper partner, someone who shares his manner of being. No animal, and they're all noble, and Adam gives them names, which is a lovely gesture of the scientific and philosophical imagination that looks out at the world and it catalogs the world. Katalogon, according to the Logos. Adam notices the inherent intelligibility of all these things, and he names them accordingly. Beautiful. But he's noticed what you just said. No matter how much intelligibility and order and harmony and beauty I find in these animals, they're not human. They're not my partner. They're not at my level of being. And so I can't be friends. Aristotle said that you can really only be friends with an equal. And so I can't find a friend among these creatures. And so only one who's bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, who's at the same level ontologically as I, can function as my partner. So we have a biblical anthropology, but now kind of a biblical account of marriage and of friendship and so on. So again, beautifully suggested what Chesterton saw, the qualitative difference between animals and human beings.
So God's created Adam and Eve. He places them in this garden, which, as we described earlier, kind of foreshadows a temple. It's a place of right praise. Most people then jump to the prohibition God gives them, which is don't eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But you've said in the past that before we get there, we should acknowledge the rangy permission, not prohibition, but permission that he gives our first parents. He says, you may freely eat of every tree in the garden. How should we read this? What's its significance?
Remember, Brandon, that dialogue I had with Alex O'Connor some months ago, and the young atheist, and he was urging, that every discussion has got to begin with the fact of suffering. And is at the very end of our dialogue, we didn't have a chance to develop it, but I said, no, you don't start with suffering. You never start with the negative, because the negative is a privatio, it's a privation of what ought to be there. Being and positivity is always more ontologically basic than negativity. That's the point. So it applies here. If you say, I'm going to begin my consideration of the spiritual life with original sin, I would say, no, No, we're off to a bad start. You don't begin with original sin. Begin, rather, with this marvelous original permission that God makes this garden. What does he want for us? Irenaeus again. His glory is that we be fully alive. So how the church fathers read the symbol of the garden with all of its richness and its trees and its fruit, that's all of human flourishing. It's science and it's friendship and it's politics and it's cities and it's everything that makes human life rich. Go, off you go. That's what God wants for us. He's not in the negation business or the denial business. He wants us to be fully alive. I've come that you might have life and have it to the full, says Jesus. So don't begin with the prohibition, because then we'll get this image, well, God is a stern lawgiver, and we tend to get everything wrong, and so there's a stern lawgiver, and we're no good. And all right, there's room for that. There is room for talking about God as a stern lawgiver. There's room for saying we tend to get everything wrong. But don't start there. Begin with what God wanted and still wants for us, and is desperately trying to recover for us, is fullness of life.
I think if someone came to one of my young kids and they said, "Tell us about your dad," and the first thing they say is, "He won't let me eat chocolate for breakfast."
Right.
It's like
Exactly,
reducing
yeah.
all of my paternal love down to that one minor prohibition.
Look, you parents, it's the master image for God in the Bible. It's the master image, is father, is parent. And so that's exactly right. That's exactly, I mean, you'd be heartbroken if Augustine, this is your Augustine, not St. Augustine, if you're Augustine or you're Isaiah, not Isaiah the prophet, but one of your kids were to say that, yeah, my dad, he's a kind of stern taskmaster, and he prohibits this, and that. You say, well, come on. I'm prohibiting those things because I love you and I want fullness of life for you. So it's the same problem. If we say, oh, what's God like? Oh, well, he's pretty difficult and pretty demanding, and he doesn't like this, and that. I'm missing the point.
All right, well, let's move from that permission to the single prohibition. Again, Genesis says, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die." Now, I know this is among the most studied passages in the whole literature of the world, not just the Bible. Mm-hmm. It's given rise to a whole number of interpretations, Jewish, Christian, even beyond. How do you understand this prohibition?
I follow John Paul II here. I think has got the richest take on it, which is God wants us to eat of all the trees. He wants us fully alive. But what's the one thing we can't do? We can't seize the prerogative of God to determine good and evil. So it's not so much, oh yeah, I understand there's good and there's evil. That's not the kind of knowledge we're talking about. It's a kind of grasping at the divine prerogative to be the criterion of good and evil. I decide. I have the knowledge. I know what's right and what's wrong. When I make that move, I've now reversed this process. Instead of losing myself in the beauty and harmony and truth and goodness of the world, I've now turned my own ego into God, and it becomes the criterion of good and evil. When I make that move, then the garden turns into a desert. You see, and it just does, and we sinners know this. That's why we recognize ourselves in this story so readily, because the garden that God wants for us becomes a desert when I determine good and evil. So that's the one thing I shouldn't do, is seize that divine prerogative. Rather, listen to God. Do what God wants, because his glory is that I be fully alive. Notice, please, what the serpent places in their minds is the suggestion that God is a rival to them. That's why I mentioned with Irenaeus, a few weeks ago, that God doesn't need us. It's so important. He's not a rival to us. His glory is not bought at the price of our suffering. On the contrary, right? So notice, please, what the serpent does. That's the problem. And when we to this day say something like that, well, God, he resents us. If we achieve something, it's like Prometheus. He's going to punish us forever. He's not like Prometheus. Thomas Merton said that. He thought the Promethean problem in religion was maybe the dominant spiritual problem of our time. That's what he meant. This illusion that we're in that kind of relationship with God. So that's how I'd read it, Brandon. I'd say don't seize the prerogative of determining good and evil for yourself. Now, mind you, all of our listeners, does that sound familiar at all? Come on. It's coming out of almost every speaker, every song, every movie today. I decide, my ego, my voice, I'll tell you what's right and wrong. Don't you lay guilt trips and value, trips on me. I determine. That's the primordial problem, as the book of Genesis lays it out quite correctly.
Well, as we all know, Adam and Eve do give in and they eat the forbidden fruit. We call this original sin, and it's part of the fall with a capital F, the fall. What does this single decision set in motion? What are the effects of the fall?
Just what we've been saying. So it symbolically now, poetically, it turns the garden into a desert because it reverses the proper momentum. The momentum is out of the self to the world, like a seed breaking open and then letting its life out, This is now the move inward. It's the deification of the self rather than the losing of the self in the values of the world. It's a deification, which then leads to an ossification. It leads to a desiccation of one's life. And now these are desert people that wrote these books, so they knew about deserts and oases. That's what we're talking about here, is going from like a beautiful oasis into the desert. That's what it feels like. That's what happens when we make this move.
Whenever I think of the fall, and I know you've quoted this line before as well, I think of the Chesterton line where he says that either original sin or the fall is the one empirically provable Christian doctrine, because you just need to open up the newspaper every day. So many people say, oh, these old stories from Genesis, these are made up mythic fairy tales. But he says, no, we have proof of at least this doctrine, don't we?
Of course. And the point is, Brandon, that once you understand that we're not dealing here with, pseudo-scientific accounts and all that nonsense, that we're dealing with this extremely rich and powerful theological and spiritual writing, we should recognize ourselves in every move in the story. It's not something from the weird, misty, mythical past. These are stories about us. Adam, I think you're Adam and Eve, they're like primordial, and their effects are everywhere. We're all their descendants. That means spiritually we participate in these same dynamics, which is why these stories continue to have such power, because of course we see ourselves in them. They're a distant mirror of all the dynamics that bedevil us to this day. So that's why these stories keep singing to us across the centuries.
Well, next time we'll continue our Understanding Genesis series by focusing on Abraham, the father of our faith. Well, it's time now for a question from one of our listeners. Today we have one from Paul in Daytona Beach down here in Florida with me. He's asking about the ending of St. Mark's Gospel. Here's his question.
Hey, Bishop Barron. My name is Paul, and I'm from Daytona Beach. And my question is, why would Mark originally end his Gospel with the women not telling the apostles about the resurrection of Jesus? Wouldn't that make the Gospel and the church impossible? Thank you, and God bless you and all your work.
Yeah, it's a good question. And, you read dozens of books on this, hundreds of books probably, on the ending of Mark's Gospel. Let me give you a couple insights. One is that the ending of Mark's Gospel, originally, might have been lost. I mean that literally and physically. Keep in mind, these were written on scrolls, right? And then they were rolled up. And a scroll, if it's rolled up and unrolled and rolled up again and so on and passed around, that especially the end of the scroll might have gotten worn away or torn away somehow. So that's one theory. See, one indication is the original Markan ending, because what we have now, there's one that was added on, they're almost sure. It's kind of tacked on a little bit later. But the original ending ends in a very peculiar way. I think it's with the Greek word gar, G-A-R, which it's like a connective. It means like for, or, it's not the way you'd ever end a sentence. That's the point. And so people think, well, I know Mark wrote in kind of a rough and ready Greek, but nevertheless, he would have known you don't end a sentence with that word. So are we literally missing something? That's altogether possible. As I say, the other ending sort of was added later. But the other thing is this. Mark is a poet, not a refined writer the way Luke or John are refined writers. But Mark, I mean, he invented the gospel form, and he was something of a literary genius, I think. I always find his original ending rather powerful and moving. That what's the response to a theophany, to a manifestation of God in the Bible, Old Testament and New? It's fear. Of course, because God is broken in. God, the creator of all things. They've had a theophany of an unsurpassed power in seeing the empty tomb and hearing the word of resurrection. And so, of course, they go away afraid. It's not the fear you'd have at watching a scary movie. It's the fear of the Lord. It's the fear in the presence of this transcendent, uncontrollable reality. I've actually preached on this on Easter Sunday when we have Mark's account because, cemeteries are very peaceful places, I've said. You go to a cemetery to muse and to meditate and to pray and remember. But who runs scared out of their wits from a cemetery? Well, nobody does. Unless in that cemetery you had a theophany of extraordinary power. And so their running away from the tomb in fear is not to be read emotionally as, oh boy, they collapsed. I'd read it as they're ready to talk. They're ready to proclaim what happened to them. Anyway, there's some perspectives on the ending of Mark. There's ample literature. If you go online, you probably can find some of the technical studies of it. But those are a couple of perspectives.
Well, thanks for the great question, Paul. And if you have a question, send it in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Also, as we wind up here, can I make another request that you please leave a review of the Word on Fire show? It helps us out a lot. It takes you less than 5 seconds. Just go to whatever podcast service you're using to listen to this, leave a quick review, and that helps those services recommend our shows to more people. So leave a review for the Word on Fire show. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time here on the Word on Fire show.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.